Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 10th of February of 2026. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with the Zaporizhzhia direction, where both the Russians and the Ukrainians continue their counter-offensive operations, but with a small difference. First let's talk about the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation that started, according to different sources, somewhere in the mid-January of 2026. This information was provided by different neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian sources, but as we can see, and according to information from media, this counter-offensive operation was hidden by the Ukrainians. They didn't want to give us a lot of updates about the situation. The same thing we can see from the Russian side. The Russians also didn't make a lot of notes or statements about this counter-offensive operation, but according to information we have, according to information in the internet, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainians, as a result of this counter-offensive operation, managed to improve their positions significantly along the river of Volcha between the settlements of Pokrovsk and Velika Mikhailovka. So these are the changes on the ground between the dates. As you can see, according to this counter-offensive operation, the armed forces of Ukraine managed to restore complete control over the settlements of Gai, Vovche, Alexeyevka, Aristopol, and as you can see, according to this map, the armed forces of Ukraine managed to approach the main defense layer of the Zaporizhzhia direction. This defense layer used to be a main defense layer, the main defense layer of the armed forces of Ukraine, but the Russians managed to capture this, let's say, defense layer almost without any resistance from the Ukrainian side, and now the Ukrainians are trying to attack this defense layer once again, but this time this defense layer is under complete control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So this is the situation. The Ukrainians managed to recapture these territories. As of now, as of the end of the 10th of February, we still haven't received anything. We're talking about videos or geolocations that can confirm this, but telling the truth, something like this most likely happened. But another important thing, we should see the difference between the real offensive operation carried out, let's say, by Russians in the same Zaporizhzhia direction, let's say during the 2025, and this counter-attack of the armed forces of Ukraine. The main difference is that the Ukrainians counter-attacked in the northern part of the Zaporizhzhia direction just with one purpose, or with two purposes. The first one, if this counter-offensive operation is successful, then Ukrainians will try to re-establish complete control over the territory. The Ukrainians will try to capture this defense layer. If this offensive operation from the Ukrainian side is not so successful, then their task is just to take under complete control the gray zone between this defense layer and the river of Volcha. According to most of the mappers, the territory between the river of Volcha and this defense layer is considered by most of the mappers as the territories either under control of the armed forces of Ukraine or under control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. But when talking about the real situation on the ground, we believe that this territory is more like a gray zone. There are soldiers of Russians and Ukrainians, but during the period of time between November, December and the first part of January, we're talking about just several soldiers in every single settlement, and the main purpose was just to win some time if the Ukrainian or the Russian side decide to attack. So basically, during the previous days, the Ukrainians took under complete control the gray zone in this area. So this was the first part or the first stage of this offensive, and now the most important question, whether the Ukrainians from this line of combat contacts are going to move further in the southern direction with the purpose to capture the first Zaporizhzhia defense layer that is currently under complete control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. As of the end of the 10th of February of 2026, we haven't received any signals that the Ukrainians are going to do this. And maybe they're not going to do this at all, because once again, this offensive operation started somewhere in the middle of January and lasted until the beginning of February, and then this offensive operation suddenly stopped. And this offensive operation suddenly stopped with the same moment when the Ukrainians cut off the Russian Starlinks from the network. So when the Russian unauthorized devices were cut off, the Ukrainians at the same time stopped this offensive operation. Maybe the Ukrainians thought and they believed and their plans were the cuts off of Starlink to force the Russians to think that it's time, it was a time for the second phase of offensive, and to force the Russians, let's say, to concentrate their main forces along this defense layer, and this, let's say, maneuver, this tricky situation would allow the Ukrainians to begin their offensive operation from the western flank with the purpose to establish complete control over the main defense layer that goes along the river of Gaichur. We are talking about this dense network of the fortifications that is located on the Ukrainian side of the river. And when the Russians were cut off from the Starlink system, the Ukrainians began their counter-offensive operation in the area of the villages of Ternavata, Priluki, and the settlement of Stara Ukrainka. And according to different mappers and according to geolocations, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours, or it's 48 hours, or even during the previous several days, managed to improve their positions in this area. But currently it's very difficult to say whether the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions significantly. So first let's talk about the settlement of Ternavata. These are the changes on the ground between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 8th of February. This is the situation by the end of the 9th of February. We adjusted the map like this during that date based on the video that was published by pro-Russian sources of how Ukrainians using vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and hundreds of infantry were attacking the settlement, and several moments were geolocated. For example, one of the moments when the Russians attacked a Ukrainian vehicle took place right exactly along the central street of the settlement. The second episode was geolocated in the northern part of the settlement of Pridorozhhia. So based on this video that was published yesterday and based on the reports that were published by different sources about the situation in Ternavata, the map was adjusted like this. But later, after additional analysis, we came to the conclusion that the Ukrainians during this offensive operation, especially around the settlement of Ternavata, were tasked to break through Russia's defense in this area and to capture the two roads that are moving in the direction of the settlement with the purpose to cut the logistic. So the Ukrainians basically were tasked to establish complete control over this part of the settlement, and the Ukrainians were tasked to establish complete control over this part of the settlement. This maneuver, if this maneuver was successful, would allow the Ukrainians to block the logistic in the direction of the city of Ternavata from the south and from the southeast. And while the Russians were trying to, and according to this plan, the Russians would be forced to spend lots of days, hours, or weeks to recapture the southern and the southeastern parts of the settlement. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians would finish the battle for the city of Ternavata because the Russian contingent in this area would remain without supply and support and without proper logistic. But according to updates that we are receiving right now from pro-Russian sources, the Ukrainians that managed to break through and most likely to establish control over these two parts were attacked by Russians during the day. The main contingent of the armed forces of the Russian Federation is still in the central part of the city, and the Russians are trying to hold their positions. The Ukrainians are counter-attacking, the counter-offensive operation continues, and once again, the main task and the main purpose of this counter-offensive operation of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, of the armed forces of Ukraine, is to establish complete control over the main Zaporizhzhia defense layer that is located between the city of Gulay-Polye in the south and, let's say, the settlements of Astapovka in the north. We are talking about this dense network of the fortifications along the river, and the Ukrainians were tasked to force the Russians to fall back from this area and to recapture the river of Gaichur. This is the main priority for the armed forces of Ukraine, because now the Ukrainians, and once again, this is just a tactical purpose. There is no task for the armed forces of Ukraine to, let's say, to break the situation in the entire conflict. There is no task for the armed forces of Ukraine to, as a result of this counter-offensive operation, let's say, to recapture the settlement of Velika Novostolka or to advance further in the southern direction towards the city of Melitopol. No, just one simple task: to recapture the river of Gaichur, and that's it. There is no more task for the armed forces of Ukraine at this stage. Because the Ukrainians understand that the Russians, and this information was confirmed by different sources, that the Russians have begun or are about to finish the preparation before the beginning of the major southern offensive operation and the eastern offensive operation. Different media published an article about the situation. Russia is preparing a spring offensive in the east and south, according to Welt. Russian troops are concentrating their forces in the east and south for the spring offensive in Ukraine, according to a German publication. The likely areas of increased activity include the Pokrovsk-Krasnoyarsk, Guliai-Polye, and the western Zaporizhzhia region. The conclusions are based on open data and satellite imagery. So this is the situation. So that is why the Ukrainians are just trying to take the gray zone under control and to recapture this position, and the Ukrainians have just one purpose for the upcoming spring and summer military campaigns. If you remember, we discussed the Russians don't need to, let's say, capture the city of Zaporizhzhia itself as a result of offensive operation. As we discussed, the main purpose for the Russians for this, let's say, offensive operation is just to get this red line. So if Russians are able to approach this red line, then from these positions, the Russians will be able to establish complete FPV drone control, artillery control over the river of Dnipro, which means that right exactly from this very moment, the Ukrainians will not be able to supply the city of Zaporizhzhia with food, with goods, with electricity, with water, with everything necessary, not just for the military purposes and for their limited contingent on the territory of the city, but also for population. And if Russians are able to get this red line, then most likely within the next 2 or 3 months after the Russians get this line, the Ukrainians would be forced to abandon their positions, abandon their homes, abandon the city in the western direction, or they will not abandon, then the Russians will encircle and the Ukrainians would be forced to surrender. So that is why it is very important for Ukrainians during 2026 to stop the Russians. I will add softly, approximately, to stop the Russians somewhere around this yellow line. So this is the task of the armed forces of Ukraine, to stop the Russians during the next by the end of August of 2026, or by the end of September, or even more, by the end of October, to make the situation that the Russians will not be able to cross this yellow line. So this approximately plus minus several kilometers, but this is the task of the armed forces, because if they can do this, then most likely the Russians will not continue their major offensive operation in the direction of the city of Zaporizhzhia during the winter period of time, and the Russians would be forced to postpone their offensive operation, their main part of the offensive operation towards the city of Zaporizhzhia, almost until April or late March of 2027. And obviously this will give Ukrainians additional time. This will take additional time from the Russian side, from their economy and so on. So this is the main task for Ukrainians, to win additional time. So let's wait and see, of course, how the things are going to develop in the Zaporizhzhia direction. But as of the 10th of February of 2026, even if the Ukrainians managed to recapture some villages through the gray zone, we see that they still haven't managed to take under control probably even a single stronghold along this dense network of the fortifications, neither along the, let's say, vertical line between Guliai-Polye and Ostapovskaya, neither along the horizon line between Ostapovskaya and the settlement of Malievka. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Zalizhnishnya. In this video, we can see how the Russians were fighting for the settlement, and in the final part of this video, we can see several places where the Russians raised their flags. So as a result of clashes, we have adjusted the map. We see that the Russians improved their position significantly. Furthermore, now we see that the Russians managed to break through the main defense defense layer of the armored forces of Ukraine towards the city of Orekhov. It seems that within the next 2 months, the Russians will be able to approach the city of Zaporizhzhia from the northeast, and the battle for this main defense layer and main defense power position will begin. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians are going to approach the city of Orekhov not just from the northeast. The Russians have already managed to do this from the southwest. According to pro-Russian sources, as a result of clashes, the Russians improved their position significantly to the southwest of the city of Orekhov, and the Russians began advancing along the village of Novoandreevka. So now the Russians are trying to take under complete control of these territories to shorten the lines and to cut the settlement of Orekhov in pincers. At the same time, the Russians are keeping advancing from the settlement of Pavlovka also in the eastern direction towards the settlement, the village of Buryakivka. So the battle for Orekhov most likely has begun with the fall of the city of Zaporizhzhia. Russians will attack, the Russians will begin offensive, or they will attack, they will continue offensive operation from the west, while the Russians are approaching the settlement from the northeast. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Dobropolye direction. During the previous 24 hours, according to neutral mappers, the armored forces of the Russian Federation finished the battle for the city by the name of Rodinska. These are the changes on the ground between the dates. This information was provided by neutral mappers. Furthermore, according to them, the Russians are keeping advancing further in the western direction, entering fields to the north of the city of Pokrovsk and beginning outflanking the maneuver of the city of Dobropolye from the south, trying to answer the villages of Shevchenko, Svitla and Vodyanskaya. So the Russians are intensifying their activities in this area. It's not yet, let's say middle or something like the main part of the offensive. It's just the beginning, but the thing is that the settlement of Dobropolye is very close to the current Russian positions, so which means that the major parts of the battle for the city will start very, very soon. As for the Konstantinovka direction, it seems that this direction is the most problematic for Russians, despite numerous reports and statements made by the commander of the Group of Forces South. I would like to remind you that 2 months ago he stated that somewhere by the by the middle of February, the commander of the Group of Forces South stated that up to 60 or 80% of the city of Konstantinovka would fall in Russia's hands, but we see that currently is the 10th of February and the Russians are at the beginning of this road, at this pass. They control just 20%, and we see that the Russians are still very far to complete this mission, this task, which means that the battle for the city will be postponed probably to the spring military campaign or to the late winter military campaign. There are going to be very heavy clashes, and the Ukrainians will try to hold their positions for as long as possible. But we can't say the same about the Slaviansk direction. According to information we have, first of all, we received the biggest number of updates exactly from this area. The Russians are keeping advancing along MO3 road. We have huge changes in this area. Huge changes have been recorded since the beginning of February of 2026, and the Russians are about to finish the battle for this territory. So we believe that in coming days, the Russians will establish complete control over everything along this red line. We are talking about the territory between the settlements of Svyatopokrovska, Nikiforovka, Fedorovka, Drugaya, Dibrov, and so on. And this is a very important thing because from these positions, Russians will be able to establish better control over the main logistics and supply lines. Furthermore, from these positions, the Russians will be able to start attacking positions, temporary deployment points through the Konstantinovka-Slaviansk agglomeration. So the situation will continue deteriorating. As for the eastern flank, as for the territory to the east of the city of Slaviansk, during the previous 24 hours, additional changes were recorded. According to information, according to media, the Russians continue advancing to the south of the settlement of Zakitna, and these 3 lines were captured. We see that the Russians are trying to cut this pocket, this salient between the villages of Zakitna and Riznikivka. Most likely in coming hours, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this area in the southwest western direction towards the main stronghold, the main defense area, the settlement of Kalenik. As you can see, there are lots of strongholds were created by the Ukrainians, so this is going to be a very tough battle. Obviously, it will take weeks or maybe weeks, days or weeks, obviously, but not months. The Russians are approaching this territory from the east and from the north. The Russians continue attacking positions of the armed forces Ukraine with a significant number of drones. In this area, we see lots of updates every single day, and not everything we can add because sometimes it's very difficult to geolocate this or that attack, but the number of videos that are coming from this area can sometimes shock because too many Russians are trying to approach the city of Slaviansk as soon as possible. As for the Liman direction, during the previous 24 hours, additional changes on the ground were also recorded. The Russians, as you can see, managed to enter the city of Liman from the north, and the Russians are keeping advancing from the east. We have geolocations confirming this. The battle, the major parts of the battle for Liman has begun. In coming days, most likely, we will start receiving updates from the central part of the settlement. So there are going to be very heavy clashes, but the Russians now will try to cut the settlement into several pieces, especially trying to cut the village somewhere in the central part, and then they will handle with every single direction separately. If it happens, of course, in all it will lead to the situation when the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from the settlement of Drobyshevo. As for the Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very interesting updates, especially from the northern part of the city. First of all, neutral mappers reported that the Russians managed to recapture some territories they lost during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And as you can see, the Russians are approaching the city of Kupiansk, its northern part, once again, using the same routes of attacks that we used to see in 2025. Furthermore, during the previous day, a video was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, this one, where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers through this entire territory. This is a very important video because there were lots of episodes geolocated. One was geolocated here, another here. But as you can see, we haven't adjusted the map because we still analyze the situation in this region, because we have some doubts whether the video is fresh or the video is archived, because maybe these attacks took place during the first counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side. We are analyzing this situation, but if we decide that the video is fresh and has been made recently, then we will adjust the map like something like this. And if this configuration of the city of Kupiansk is correct, then we can say that the battle for the city of Kupiansk, despite numerous counteroffensives from the Ukrainian side, is coming to its logical end. And if, once again, this configuration is correct and these geolocations are fresh, then most likely the city of Kupiansk would be colored back in red color in coming weeks. As for the northern directions, during the previous 24 hours, the very big activity was recorded along the border. The Russians were bombing this huge forest. Either the Ukrainians are concentrating their forces, or the Russians are trying to destroy Ukraine's strongholds with the purpose to keep advancing further deep inside of the Kharkiv region. So we will keep an eye on this area. Another important region is the Sumy direction. During the previous day, we received lots of very important updates. The Russians continue attacking and destroying the Ukraine's logistics in this area. Since the beginning of December, we received dozens of videos of how the Russians were attacking trains, energy infrastructure, and different launching sites of the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is also a very interesting dynamic, because either the Ukrainians are, it is always like this everywhere, either the Ukrainians are concentrating their forces to attack deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation from the Sumy region, or the Russians are beginning a clearing operation with the purpose to improve their positions before the beginning of the major offensive operation, which also may take place during the spring military campaign. And based on the updates that we are receiving from this area, it's possible that during the spring and summer military campaigns, there are going to be two primary directions. The first primary direction is the city of Zaporizhzhia, and the second primary direction would be the Slaviansk Kramatorsk agglomeration, and there are going to be several secondary directions like the Sumy direction and the Kharkiv direction. So everything is possible, and obviously soon we will understand everything. In the months we will clearly understand what is going to happen in April and May of 2026. Meanwhile, we see that the Russians are quitting and abandoning the Anchorage agreements. They're saying that the United States of America is not doing anything from their side. Spirit of Anchorage has soared. The US is no longer ready to accept its proposals on Ukraine made in Anchorage. These statements are very important because, according to information we have, the Russians and the United States of America agreed that in Anchorage to achieve a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are required just one thing: to withdraw their positions from the rest of the Donetsk region. So we are talking just about these territories. And due to the fact that the Russians began saying that the United States of America are not following the spirit of Anchorage agreements, this means that the Russians most likely in coming days or weeks, when they will understand completely that nothing like this is going to happen, we're talking about Anchorage agreements, then most likely the Russians will change their demands, and most likely the Russians will include the siege of Zaporizhzhia as a part of these demands and something like this. So anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. That's it. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.